So we are now looking at the form of homicide with which you're probably most familiar, murder in the first. And most states differentiate between first degree murder and some other form of homicide. Most states only have first and second degree murder. Pennsylvania has a category called third degree murder. And I won't get too much into the weeds on this right now, but basically the reason for this is most states that differentiate forms of murder have two ways to show first degree murder, either an intentional killing or felony murder, which we'll get into later, but we introduced that in one of the quizzes. Most states will define either of those as a form of first degree murder. Pennsylvania has as first degree murder an intentional killing and as second degree murder felony murder. And then what most states identify as second degree murder, Pennsylvania will call third. Now, the only difference in Pennsylvania between first and second degree murder is that second degree murder does not carry the potential of the death penalty. So for 99.9% of murderers, the punishment for first and second degree murder is indistinguishable because, for all practical purposes, Pennsylvania really doesn't have the death penalty now. We're not carrying it out under the current governor. And even when we are actively carrying it out, there are so few people who take the lives of other people who are tried for their lives. Most of the time, the trial is just to try to obtain a life sentence, and then juries, then only bring back death sentences in a portion of those cases. So really, when you're looking at the fact Pennsylvania has a separate category for first and second degree murder, those are different ways of defining homicide, but the penalties that first and second degree murder carry in Pennsylvania are for all practical purposes the same. So we're starting with first degree, the one that you are the most familiar with. There are movies about this. There's Murder in the First, I think it was a Kevin Bacon film. And most all your crime thrillers are intentional killings. So you're familiar with this notion. So let's pull up on our chart first degree murder and look at the statute. And in Pennsylvania, you'll see that the mens rea for this form of homicide is embodied in one word, intentional. A criminal homicide constitutes murder in the first degree when it is committed by an intentional killing. You'll find in other states, this statute will be defined by things like premeditation, deliberation, intentional, premeditated, and deliberated in some states. But they're all saying the same thing. You consciously formed the desire to kill. Now, let me screen share on that. There we are. You consciously formed the desire to kill. Criminal homicide constitutes first degree murder when it's committed by an intentional killing. So now let's put a little bit of skin on that before we actually delve into the Pennsylvania cases. So how does Pennsylvania's legislature help us understand that particular term? You would think intentional wouldn't be that hard, but as we get into the facts, you'll find out that it's harder than it might seem. So an intentional killing. Another section of the Pennsylvania Code, 2502D, says killing by means of poison, lying in wait, or other kinds of willful, deliberate, or premeditated killing. So the example, obviously, if you poison someone, you've thought about it. Unless, as we talked about in one of my classes, unless you have rat poison sitting on the counter to poison rats, and you aren't careful with it and you pour it into someone's drink. If you intentionally poison, then you have thought about it. It would be really a rare thing when you wouldn't have. Lying in wait, again, lying in wait would be an example. You're waiting for the person to arrive. That shows some period of deliberation. But then, as with a lot of these statutes, we see any other kind of willful, deliberate or premeditated killing. So even though Pennsylvania uses the term intent in the definition, then when it comes down to offer the examples, it still uses the same terminology that a lot of other states do: willful, deliberate, and premeditated. You would think that that would carry, some real heft, that like that would require, planning or plotting or, collections of weapons or explosives, etc. It turns out it's not that hard to show that despite the, deliberate, premeditated, turns out premeditation can be formed fairly quickly, or can be had fairly quickly. We'll talk about that in our next series of videos. But this introduces to you the statutory landscape by which we arrive at the notion of first-degree murder.